The morning sun shone over the quiet town of Brooksville, Tennessee, casting long shadows over the suburban streets. It was a peaceful neighborhood where everyone knew each other and crime was rare. But on this day, the silence was shattered by the wail of sirens. At 7:42 a.m., a sanitation worker named Greg Wilson was collecting trash on Maplewood Drive when he noticed something unusual. A large black trash bag sat oddly at the end of a driveway, away from the usual bins. Its shape was irregular, bulging in strange places. When he lifted it, the weight was unexpected. Curious and uneasy, Greg opened the bag slightly, and what he saw made him stumble backward. A severed human hand, its fingers stiff and pale, lay atop bloodied plastic sheets. Greg's hands trembled as he fumbled for his radio, calling in the discovery. Within minutes, flashing blue and red lights filled the street. Detective Raymond Holt, a seasoned investigator with over 20 years in homicide, arrived at the scene. His eyes, sharp and calculating, surveyed the surroundings. He had seen his share of gruesome crime scenes, but dismemberment always carried a unique brutality. The bag's contents were transported to the county medical examiner's office. A forensic team combed through the scene, securing any evidence that could lead to identifying the victim. They didn't have to wait long. A second bag was found in the backyard of the same house, partially hidden beneath a pile of leaves. This one contained a torso wrapped in thick plastic. Detective Holt knocked on the door of the house. A man in his mid-30s, disheveled and visibly shaken, answered. His name was Brian Green. His voice wavered as he explained that his wife, Shirley Green, had been missing for 2 days. He had filed a report, but assumed she had left after an argument. Now, standing before the detective, his hands trembled as he covered his mouth in shock at the gruesome discovery. The forensic team confirmed the remains belonged to a female, but they needed further testing to confirm her identity. Brian was taken in for questioning, his demeanor shifting from shock to quiet resignation. His story was simple. He and Shirley had been arguing for weeks, and she left after a heated confrontation. He claimed he had no idea what happened to her afterward. Detective Holt wasn't convinced. Something about Brian's behavior felt rehearsed, too controlled. Years of experience had taught him that guilt had a way of seeping through even the most practiced facades. As the investigation unfolded, neighbors came forward with details. One reported hearing loud noises coming from the Greens' house 2 nights prior. Another recalled seeing Brian taking out heavy trash bags late at night, something he had never done before. Holt made a mental note to check security footage from nearby houses. The medical examiner's report arrived later that evening. The remains were indeed Shirley Green's. Her body had been dismembered with precision, likely by someone familiar with anatomy. The cuts were clean and deliberate. There were no defensive wounds, indicating she may have been unconscious or already deceased before dismemberment. Toxicology tests were ordered to determine if she had been drugged. Holt sat in his office, reviewing the evidence. Brian was the prime suspect, but something felt off. The murder was too calculated, the disposal too hasty. And if Brian had killed his wife in a crime of passion, why take the time to dismember her? The next morning, Detective Holt returned to the Greens' residence. Crime scene tape stretched across the front yard as forensic analysts continued combing through the property. Holt had reviewed the security footage from the neighboring homes overnight. The recordings showed Brian carrying multiple trash bags to his car under the cover of darkness. The timestamp put him outside at 2:14 a.m., hours after he claimed to have last seen Shirley. Something didn't add up. Holt walked through the house, taking in every detail. The living room was neat, almost too neat. The couch cushions were fluffed, and the coffee table was free of dust or fingerprints. The kitchen, however, smelled faintly of bleach. That was never a good sign. He turned his attention to the garage. A forensic tech was dusting the doorknob for prints when Holt noticed a large plastic sheet balled up in the corner. He unfolded it carefully. Streaks of what looked like dried blood ran along its surface. Nearby, a set of gardening shears lay abandoned. The blades had rust-colored stains. Holt stepped outside to where Brian stood, his hands shoved into his pockets. His eyes darted nervously as he spoke. "I already told you everything I know," Brian said, his voice thin. "I didn't do anything to Shirley." Holt studied him for a long moment before responding. "Then you won't mind if we take a closer look at your car." Brian hesitated but then nodded. The forensic team got to work, swabbing the trunk and seats. Within minutes, a faint blood stain lit up under the forensic light. That was the break Holt needed. Back at the station, Holt dug deeper into Brian and Shirley's relationship. Their financial records showed multiple recent withdrawals, large sums that didn't match their usual spending habits. Brian had also made several late-night phone calls to an unknown number in the days leading up to Shirley's disappearance. The detective sat at his desk, poring over the financial records again. Something about the transactions gnawed at him. The large withdrawals didn't align with Brian and Shirley's usual spending patterns. The calls to the unknown number intrigued him even more. He passed the information to the tech team, requesting a full trace. Meanwhile, forensic results from Brian's car came back. The blood in the trunk was a match for Shirley. That, combined with the security footage, was enough for an arrest. Holt and his team moved in swiftly. Brian was taken into custody, his face pale but expressionless. He didn't resist, but his silence was telling. Their kids were taken by officials pending when the investigation was over. At the interrogation room, Holt laid out the evidence. The trash bags, the bleach, the blood in the car, all of it pointed to Brian's involvement. But as Holt pressed him, Brian maintained his innocence. "I didn't kill her," Brian finally muttered. "Then explain the evidence," Holt countered, "because right now it tells a different story." Brian looked away, his jaw tightening. He seemed to be struggling internally, weighing something. Holt knew the signs of a man with secrets. Later that evening, Holt received a call from the tech team. The unknown number Brian had been calling belonged to a prepaid burner phone. However, they had managed to track a related purchase at a gas station. Surveillance footage showed Brian buying the phone, but he wasn't alone. A tall, older man stood beside him. Holt leaned forward, scrutinizing the screen. The man looked familiar. After a few minutes of searching through old records, he found what he was looking for. The man was Henry Green, Brian's father. The revelation changed everything. Why had Brian needed a burner phone, and why involve his father? Determined to get answers, Holt visited Henry Green's house the next morning. The elderly man greeted him with wary eyes. His house was modest but meticulously kept. Something about his demeanor made Holt uneasy. "I need to ask you about Brian," Holt began. "About Shirley." Henry's expression remained neutral. "What about them?" Holt studied him. "He's been calling you, a lot, right before Shirley disappeared." A flicker of something, fear, guilt, crossed Henry's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." Holt wasn't convinced. He decided to apply more pressure. Shirley was dismembered. Someone took great care in making sure her body was disposed of properly. This wasn't a random act of rage. It was calculated. Henry's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a cup of coffee on the table. Holt didn't miss it. "Brian was seen buying a burner phone with you. We traced calls made from it. I think you know exactly what happened to Shirley." Henry set the cup down carefully. "You think I had something to do with this?" "I think you know more than you're saying." For a long moment, Henry didn't speak. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You don't know the half of it." "You tell me that is why I am here." Henry replied, "Like I said, I don't know what you are talking about." Detective Holt left Henry Green's house with more questions than answers. Henry's words haunted him. What was he hiding? And why did Brian need a burner phone to communicate with him? Holt suspected that Shirley's murder was part of a much darker family secret. Back at the station, Holt's team continued to gather evidence. The forensic analysis of Brian's and Henry's phone records revealed a disturbing pattern. There were dozens of calls exchanged between them in the weeks leading up to Shirley's murder. Most were brief, but some lasted up to an hour. Holt requested a deeper dive into the contents of these conversations, but it would take time. Meanwhile, traces of blood were found in the backyard, partially cleaned but still detectable with luminol. The garage floor also showed signs of an attempted cleanup, but Holt knew that no one could erase every trace of a crime this gruesome. Holt decided to re-examine Shirley's personal life. He went through her phone records, emails, and social media accounts, hoping to find anything that might explain why she had been killed so brutally. That's when he discovered an email exchange between Shirley and an unknown sender. The messages were cryptic, but hinted at a serious confrontation. One email stood out. "I know you don't want Brian to find out the kids are not his, but one day he will get to find out." The email was sent just 2 days before her murder. The sender's identity was masked, but Holt suspected it could be linked to Henry Green. Did Shirley know about Brian's father's dark past? Was she threatening to expose something? As Holt dug deeper, he learned more about Henry Green's past. Decades ago, Henry worked as a butcher. His skills in handling knives and cutting meat with precision suddenly took on a sinister significance. The forensic team had already determined that Shirley's dismemberment was not the work of an amateur. Holt was beginning to connect the dots. Determined to confront Henry again, Holt returned to his house. But when he arrived, something was wrong. The front door was slightly open. A sick feeling spread through him as he stepped inside. The living room was in disarray. Papers were scattered, and a chair was overturned. There was no sign of Henry. Detective Holt wasted no time. He immediately issued a statewide APB for Henry Green, alerting all law enforcement agencies to be on the lookout for the missing man. Holt had a sinking feeling that Henry was running not just from the police, but from something far more sinister, his own past catching up with him. Back at the station, the forensic team traced Henry's last known location. Surveillance footage from a highway gas station captured him purchasing fuel and supplies and heading south. Holt suspected he was attempting to flee the state. He assembled a task force and plotted a strategy to track him down before he could disappear completely. As the search intensified, Holt decided to visit Brian Green. The interrogation room felt colder than usual, the overhead light casting harsh shadows across Brian's face. He had barely spoken since his arrest, maintaining his claim of innocence. But with Henry now a fugitive, Holt knew it was time to push harder. Holt slid a copy of Henry's note across the table. "Your father is running." "Why?" Brian's eyes flickered with emotion, fear, anger, perhaps regret. He exhaled sharply but said nothing. Holt leaned forward. "We found your wife's body near your home. We found your father's prints in your garage. And now, he's gone. What was he running from?" Brian clenched his jaw, his hands forming tight fists on the table. Holt could see the battle raging within him. Finally, Brian muttered, "He's afraid of what you'll find." That was all Holt needed to hear. He left the room, adrenaline surging. If Henry was afraid of what they might uncover, Holt knew they were close to exposing the truth. Within hours, an unmarked patrol car spotted Henry's vehicle abandoned near a stretch of dense forest. Holt and his team arrived at the scene, flashlights cutting through the night as they searched the perimeter. Deep boot prints led away from the car and into the woods. Holt knew they had to move fast. If Henry disappeared into the wilderness, finding him could take days, and time was not on their side. With weapons drawn, the team advanced into the darkness, determined to uncover the secrets Henry Green was desperate to keep buried. The dense forest was eerily silent as Detective Holt and his team pressed forward, their flashlights cutting through the thick underbrush. Henry Green was out there, and Holt was determined to find him before he vanished for good. The abandoned car suggested Henry had planned his escape carefully, but something told Holt that the old man's desperation would soon work against him. After nearly an hour of tracking through the woods, the team came upon a small, run-down cabin. Its windows were dark, the door slightly ajar. Holt motioned for his officers to surround the structure. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine, adding to the tension. He took a deep breath before stepping inside, gun drawn. The interior was sparse: a table, a single chair, and an old wood stove. In the corner, a cot with a thin, rumpled blanket suggested recent use. Then, a sound. A faint rustling from behind a wooden partition. Holt signaled to his team and moved closer. With one swift motion, he pushed the partition aside, revealing Henry Green, hunched over, gripping a worn leather bag. Henry's face was pale, his eyes hollow. He didn't resist as Holt pulled him to his feet. "It's over, Henry," Holt said firmly. Henry nodded slowly. "I know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Back at the station, Henry was placed in an interrogation room. Holt sat across from him, studying the broken man. Henry had spent his life hiding secrets, but now there was nowhere to run. "Tell me everything," Holt demanded. "No more games." Henry sighed, rubbing his temples. "It started years ago," he admitted. "Brian isn't just my son. He's also my biggest mistake." Holt's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Henry looked up, his expression raw with guilt. "Brian's children, they're not his. They're mine." The room fell into silence. Holt felt the weight of Henry's confession settles in the air like a thick fog. This was the missing piece of the puzzle. "Brian found out, didn't he?" Holt pressed. Henry nodded. "When Shirley told him, he snapped. He called me in a panic. He was angry. He said his wife betrayed him, and I did too. In a rage, he hit her, and she hit her head on a wooden shelf in the kitchen and died. He quickly called me and explained what had happened. When I got there, I asked for forgiveness from Brian, and after a while, that was when I dismembered her. He didn't mean to, but it was too late. She was dead." Holt leaned forward. "And you helped him cover it up." Henry exhaled sharply. "I didn't know what else to do. He's my son. I couldn't let him go to prison. We cleaned up, got rid of the body. But we couldn't erase the truth." Holt sat back, absorbing the confession. It was a tangled web of deceit, one that had destroyed an entire family. Now, both father and son would face justice for their crimes. Henry lowered his head. "I ran because I knew this day would come." Holt stood, signaling for the guards, and now it has. As Henry was led away, Holt let out a slow breath. The case had been cracked, but there was no victory in this kind of justice. Only the cold reality of what humans were capable of when their darkest secrets were brought to light. The courthouse buzzed with murmurs as the trial of Brian Green and his father, Henry, began. Reporters lined the steps outside, their cameras flashing as Detective Holt arrived. This case had shaken the town, revealing secrets so vile that even the most hardened investigators had struggled to process them. Now it was time for justice to be served. Inside, the courtroom was packed with onlookers. Shirley's family sat in the front row, their faces pale and drawn. Brian sat at the defendant's table, his hands folded, his eyes vacant. Henry, shackled beside him, appeared aged beyond his years. The weight of their crimes had drained the life from them both. The prosecution laid out the case methodically, presenting forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and the damning confession Holt had extracted from Henry. The jury listened intently as the details of Shirley's murder were recounted: the gruesome dismemberment, the failed cover-up, the tangled web of deception that had led to her death. Gasps rippled through the room as photographs of the crime scene were displayed. When it was time for Henry to testify, he took the stand with a resigned expression. His voice was steady, but his words carried the tremor of regret. He admitted everything: the affair with Shirley, the truth about the children, Brian's violent outburst, and his role in disposing of Shirley's remains. When asked why he had protected Brian instead of seeking justice for Shirley, Henry simply lowered his gaze. "He's my son," he whispered. Brian's defense attorney argued for leniency, claiming temporary insanity in the heat of the moment. But the jury saw through it. The prosecution painted a picture of a man consumed by rage, incapable of controlling his violent tendencies. They played the 911 call Shirley had made moments before her death, a chilling recording of her pleading with Brian before the line went dead. After days of testimony, the jury deliberated for only a few hours. The verdict was swift, guilty on all counts. Brian was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Henry, though spared the death penalty due to his cooperation, received 25 years for his role in the cover-up. As the judge read the sentences, Holt watched the reaction in the courtroom. Shirley's family embraced, tears streaming down their faces. Henry remained motionless, his fate sealed. Brian showed no emotion, as if he had accepted his punishment long before the verdict was read. Outside, Holt took a deep breath. The case was closed, but the scars it left behind would never fade. He had seen the worst of humanity, the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of ordinary lives. There were no winners in a case like this, only broken people, shattered families, and a truth too horrific to ignore. As he walked away from the courthouse, the autumn wind carried the echoes of justice. Another case would come, another mystery to solve. But for now, Detective Holt could finally close this chapter, knowing that Emily Carter's voice had been heard. Thank you for listening to True Crime Pulse. Share your thoughts on the story, like and subscribe to the channel. Until next episode, when we bring you more crime stories, stay safe.